Take you back to the breaking news from South African Airways, and the SAA Business Rescue Plan has crossed a major hurdle after a majority of the airline's creditors voted in favour of the plan. The roadmap, which got the support of 86% of the creditors at today's meeting, will now be adopted and implemented after a 6-month delay. But that is not the only breaking news line from South African Airways this afternoon. The meeting held today has also announced that Philip Saunders has been appointed interim CEO of the national carrier. Saunders was at the International Air Transport Association before joining SAA. The Public Enterprises Department also saying this afternoon that it will be announcing an interim board for the airline in the coming days. Let's speak now to aviation expert and editor at SA Flyer magazine, Guy Leitch, to get reaction to everything we've heard in the last, hour or so. Guy, are you surprised at the appointment of Philip Saunders?
A little bit, yes. Hi, nice to be with you. The reason is simply because he's not a political appointment. He has already been at SAA for a number of years. He has got a good track record at SAA. In fact, I think that he's been remarkably successful behind the scenes over the past couple of weeks and months, returning most of SAA's fleet to its lessors, which must have been a huge task given the current condition of the actual airline industry and the reluctance of lessors to take their aircraft behind. So I think he's accomplished an awful lot. I think he's a fellow who's been appointed on the basis of competence rather than any other reason. So for that reason, there is some comfort that the airline may have a chance going forward, but not much.
Some could argue, Guy, that the likes of Vuyani Jahana were also appointed and capable people who could have done things at SAA, but because of how complicated a business it is, just in terms of expectations from the shareholder and Labour, even the most competent people do not succeed at running SAA. Why would he be different?
Yeah, there's no question that Vuyani Jahana was competent. The problem was that he was continuously either undermined by government or just didn't get the support that he'd been promised when he took on the job. That made his ability to deliver on his business plan, which was, I need to point out, an incredibly expensive business plan costing 21 billion rand, quite impossible. It was absolutely necessary for him to preserve what little reputation he had left by getting out when he did. And this is the problem going forward again. Mr. Saunders is appointed as an acting CEO, and there's a fair chance that he won't, in fact, be appointed as the permanent CEO. And an acting CEO is a terrifically compromised position. No one quite knows whether you're in the seat or not. You don't really have the long-term comfort or the tenure to be able to implement long-term decisions, which is what actually needed. The airline needs long-term disciplines in terms of bringing its procurement under control, in terms of getting rid of poor management, in terms of right-sizing and so on, if it is going to survive the next 9 months, let alone be in a position to start actually flying routes effectively, if not profitably, next year.
Earlier, I spoke to the National Transport Movement, who was saying, while they welcome Mr. Saunders' appointment in the role of interim CEO, they don't want him to be acting for more than 2 months. Is that feasible for SAA, precisely because of what you've just said, in terms of what one could possibly achieve in a short space of time? What's the point of making it 2 or 9 months? What difference does it make?
Yeah, it's extremely unlikely that they will be able to find a permanent CEO within the 2 months, simply because it takes about 4 to 6 months to find somebody. You don't want to find somebody who's immediately available, because he would naturally be unemployed at this stage. We've seen 6 months to appoint a CEO. They were in the process of appointing a CEO towards the end of last year, but that process was stopped. And I should imagine any of the CEOs who might have thrown their hat into the ring at that stage would no longer be prepared to do so, particularly given the current very weak condition of the SAA business plan. This is, in my opinion, one of the worst or the weakest business plans we've ever seen, simply because it was not a business plan to turn around the airline. It was written to appease the creditors. That it's done, but we have very little accurate guidance as to what the airline is going to do, what it's going to look like, what route it's going to fly, what aircraft it's going to use, even really how many people it's going to have going forward. And we don't know that because of the crisis of the COVID pandemic effectively grounding airlines, not just in South Africa, but around the world.
Interesting that you point to the weakness of the business plan, because that was the initial criticism even from some unions in the initial phase. In the last week, week and a half, we've seen government and unions slowly begin to warm up to each other, at least in the main, but not everyone is united. So what complication, what degree of complication does that add to Philip Saunders' aspirations and work at SAA, even as an interim CEO?
Well, the real difference between this business plan and the previous business plan is very small. It is essentially a further concession by the business rescue practitioners to provide training, if you like, for 1,000 furloughed or laid off workers who would expect to be laid off for about a year. And they were going to get training and be able to be kept on at least onto the airline's staff complement, so they could be called back after about a year. That's an additional cost of about 54 billion rand. It's not actually a significant improvement or change in the way the business rescue plan has been structured. And as I indicated, the current business rescue plan, at least what we've seen of it, is incredibly thin on detail as to what routes will be operated with what aircraft and where. And it's made extremely sweeping statements about the staff complement. You know, it says 1,000 employees building up again. Now, that's reasonable, but the assumptions behind it are, quite frankly, not believable. It assumes that the airline will be profitable with a load of 61%. No airline is ever going to be profitable in this day and age with 61% load. So I find a lot of it hard to believe.
Final question then, Guy. There was reluctance from Treasury to put forward some of the billions needed to help SAA. That figure of 10 billion rand, I think it was, that was floating about. Treasury, speaking to my colleague Sally Burdett last week, was saying, look, the idea from Treasury wasn't that there would never be any money. Government is, in fact, working on a plan to bring forward the finances needed to make this BRP plan work. When things stand, do you think that figure will likely be higher?
We don't know. And I find it extremely interesting that they went into this creditors meeting to approve the business plan without even having the letter from government that says that the government is prepared to actually underwrite the process or provide the necessary finance. It simply says, oh, don't worry, government will give it to us tomorrow. I think there will be huge trouble if government fails to produce this letter tomorrow. And we don't know whether it is for the 5 billion that is required to just immediately keep the airline going, or whether it's for the original 14 billion, which is the 10 billion that you mentioned, plus another 4.3 billion in terms of voluntary severance packages, layoff costs, and so on. And then, of course, we get to a figure of 30 billion, but that's the same 14 billion plus another 16 billion for the payment of debt, its old debt to the banks. So who knows? It's anyone's guess at this stage as to how much the government will provide. But I think it's important to bear in mind that Tito Mboweni, the Minister of Finance, says there will be no more money, whereas Pravin Gordhan has said he'll preserve costs at any stage. So I wait with interest what sort of money will be found tomorrow.
Guy Leitch, thank you so much for that. And it was the Acting Director General at the Public Enterprises that I was referring to there as far as those government comments about what will be done to finance the SAA Business Rescue Plan.